Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
I want to talk about observing Jesus, watching Jesus, being concerned about the way of Jesus. In our sophisticated Western world, we do say some unusual things. I can remember as a young person, when it rained, mind you, it didn't rain like it has here this last week. Let me tell you, Europe doesn't have rain like we can get it. And when it comes, it comes. And when that came down, I remember people saying it's raining cats and dogs outside. Well, I didn't open the window to see if there's any cats falling down from the sky. And then I can remember going to get some milk from the fridge and hearing somebody in the family say, "Have you been to milk the cow?" It took that long to get there. Well, I start with a saying that is a bit similar in a way. My father was giving directions to someone and said to him, "You'll come to a fork in the road." Well, think about it for a moment, a fork. The thought of a utensil suddenly flying up from the center of the road wasn't really what it was about. And yet it's quite a picture, really, because in our Bibles tonight, in Mark chapter 8, we come to a fork in the road. A fork in the road which gives you two options, this way or that way. The disciples are being offered that as they make their confession, their declaration, their openness as they observe Jesus as to just who he is. It is from this moment on in Mark's gospel that they make their choice. Jesus comes to one of those forks in the road. It's probably 2.5 years since those disciples heard him by the lake call them to follow him. And they'd embarked on a journey of discovery. They'd watched him touch people who were the untouchables. They'd listened to teaching in a way that they had never heard before. And they began to consider what the future might hold for them as they followed him. But they arrive at a watershed, a hilltop, a moment, a fork where they must make some choices themselves. There's an urgency in following Jesus, which none of us can avoid. The moments of decision in our lives come not only once, but frequently. At those moments when choices have to be made, when priorities have to be delineated, when we have to make the choices that are important. My favorite dentist story, though I don't think there are many favorite dentist stories that I have, is of the aggressive businessman was in the dentist's chair, and the dentist put it to him that he should floss twice a day, at a minimum. And he objected to this. He thought, in all my important cutting deals and business life, how can I possibly do that? So the dentist took a slightly different tack. He said, "All right, just brush and floss the teeth you want to keep." Which is an interesting way of putting the same kind of question. There are many occasions that become critical watershed moments where the decisions taken have implications. They're going to be the beginning of something fresh and new, or it's going to be a dangerous moment. They watched him, for example, when he touched the outcasts. He was invited into a Pharisee's home in Luke 14. There were others who were observing him with a much more sinister intention. As these disciples watched Jesus, listened to Jesus, they knew they weren't the only ones listening to him and observing him. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, something significant is happening. Something critically important is taking place in terms of the relationship between Jesus and the disciples. From this place where only a few were with him, he'd taken that inner circle with him. And to get a hold of this, you have to look at it from Matthew's gospel and have a full gospel picture to see that truth. And they're with him. It's a place of real observation where you really can see something into the nature, character, and personhood of Jesus Christ. And at this point, they could look back. They could look back on the journey that they'd made up to this point in following him. It had been exciting, it had been exhilarating, it had been demanding, and yet now, as they begin to look forward, they realize the challenge is there for them. And so that's why, immediately following these verses in Mark chapter 8, we're told that he began to teach them the things that the Son of Man was going to have to endure. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. This is when Peter, you remember, took him to one side to rebuke him. Surely not. But Caesarea Philippi is that kind of moment, a watershed moment, a time to look back, a time to anticipate what the future might hold. It would be good for us to relate our own discipleship and journey of discipleship in terms of the ministry of Jesus and what the disciples were learning in those moments. Without a doubt, it is a fork in the road moment. A decision has to be made about how they're to live from this moment on. Let me say a number of things about this particular passage. First of all, the identification of Jesus Christ as they observed him is clear. The setting of Caesarea Philippi is specific. I remember going to Banias, to the place that this probably was. It's in the Lebanon. And I remember driving along there on a very, very straight road, past lots of the Druze villages on left and right. And eventually you would come to this place. So you have in your mind already that Jesus had taken them away from their normal locale to somewhere quite specific to give them an insight into a profound truth. It was beyond the Galilee, beyond Herod's patch. It had got a checkered religious history. In fact, if you were to go there today, you will see in the rock plinths, where plinths were, and statues to Pan, the gods of other religions and cultures, are all to be hung there. It makes an awful lot more sense when you hear Jesus say, "And who do you say I am?" when you know that it happened in the context of a place that was so multicultural, it's unbelievable. "And who do you say that I am?" Jesus is asking that, not just in terms of what the other lads back there think, but how do you make a decision about him in the context of your culture and the place in which you spend your daily lives? It was a rather unexpected place for the Messiah to be recognized. Because that's the message that's quite clear here, is that he is the Messiah. He is the anointed one. He's the chosen one. And where is that recognized? But in this place. It's an appropriate place, however, for Jesus to challenge them. It happens that way, doesn't it, really? That in fact, very often, the moments when we recognize something become opportunities for a greater lesson. So as they recognized who Jesus was, so Jesus opened up the possibility then, or the challenge or the adventure that lay ahead of them. It seems to me that it is a very special moment. Jesus wanted to be very clear as to whether Peter had really got an understanding of who he was. You could say that Jesus was preparing Peter for leadership. For Peter is the first leader in the church. He is the one at Pentecost that will stand up and speak for the rest. Peter stood up and all the disciples stood up with him. That's full of meaning. And he is being prepared for something that is quite unthinkably challenging as far as he's concerned. And Jesus wanted to be clear that he got it. Mark's gospel could be said to be a book that is full of challenges. Challenges that are about what it means to follow, what it is to believe. There's a whole succession of them from John the Baptist onward as you turn the pages. But when you get to this midsection, remember Mark's gospel is only 16 chapters long. When you get to this midsection, when you move to chapter 9, it's not just halfway through the gospel, the whole gospel takes a new direction. For from this moment, he begins his journey to the cross. From this moment, he begins to describe to those disciples what it will mean for them to be true to him. I think you can interpret Mark's gospel in those terms. He and perhaps others are making progress. Peter, I think, is making progress. We're very quick, to say about Peter. The sermons I've heard, when saying, he's a bit of a loudmouth, he's always impetuous. I could write them. I've heard them that many times. Gosh, you and I don't stand anywhere next to Peter when it comes to having had to make difficult choices. Nowhere. And I think we need to acknowledge that these disciples were beginning to get it, even though they didn't like it. And sometimes when you don't like it, you change the story. And I think that's why Peter wanted to change the story from time to time. Oh, no. And when it came later about, everybody else can leave you, we won't leave you. But the reality is that the door was knocking very clearly for Peter about his direction and his purpose. Becomes painfully clear that they didn't fully comprehend his identity, but they were beginning to sense it, to leave self behind, to take up the cross, and to come with him. Many Christians in our Western society do not suffer in the way that many Christians across the world are suffering. Not may suffer, are suffering. Many that are having to make their declaration for belonging to Jesus Christ. Increasing numbers of them suffering and losing their lives. When you think of Christians that are leaving parts of Africa, Syria and places like that in our world, it's tough for so many of them today. In the lifetime of so many, thousands of Christians suffered. Hundreds of clergy and laity alike knew what it was to be arrested when the Third Reich took its power and rose in Germany at that time. It were many priests and pastors that knew what it was to try to be true to that confession of Christ that was theirs. But there's more than that. Many people in the political studies in struggles in South America, mission stations in Africa, the 20th century has had its own pain. And who could not be moved from that story in France only a few weeks ago, where an elderly priest, Father Jack Hamill, was conducting Mass and his throat was slit. Let's not get soft about this stuff that talks about suffering, because though it doesn't fit into our language and setting culturally always, it does to many in the world. Sometimes the biggest suffering we have is being ignored. But the reality is that it is a powerful, powerful presence in many parts of the world. Maximilian Lolbe exchanged places with condemned Jews when it came to the camps and was starved before being fatally injected with carbolic acid. Not a horror story. The worst horror stories in the world are always true. You can't make them up. Bonhoeffer, in that church, one of the last people to be put to death before the end of the Second World War. But for every well-known martyr, there are countless thousands and thousands of unknown martyrs who are knowing what it is to hear the truth of what Jesus was trying to get through the thick skulls of his near disciples. That it's going to be like this. Just as I suffer, so you will have to walk that journey with me. There can be a huge gap between our understanding of Jesus Christ and the specific challenges that we have to face today. However, I'm certain there is a link. If we share the distinctive call of being a disciple of Jesus, so these words have to mean something to us and for us. We recognize that Jesus gave priority to so many that were outside the religious structures of his own day. We must make sure our religion is not about keeping our buildings cleaned and polished. It's not looking after ourselves and our own, but being concerned about those people who are beyond the regular reach of our daily lives. It's not something that Wesley Mission would need to learn probably quite as keenly as some might, but we too have to learn it again and again and again. Then let me talk about the identification of Jesus Christ. It was arrived at by induction and inspiration. You know, there's a moment in this declaration where there is this sense in which they were able to say who he is. You are the Messiah. Now, how did he get to that conclusion, Peter? Well, I think he got to it from both ends on. He certainly got it by observing Jesus, by a sense of induction, from knowing and picking up from things he said, things he did, that there's more to Jesus than just a guy who's called us to be one of his followers. It's something far more. The identification of Jesus Christ was arrived at by induction and inspiration. Induction from their character and their works, seeing him with the tax collectors, seeing him with the outcasts, seeing him with what they call the sinners, of which they were, of course, themselves. But inspiration from God. In Matthew's gospel, we have this, you know, that didn't come from your own intuition. That was gifted by God. So for Peter and for everybody, when you reach those fork in the road moments, there are two things you're looking for: what you can see and what you're seeking God to reveal to you. And so it is that's what's happening in these moments. The Christ in Greek, the Messiah in Hebrew, and the Aramaic meaning anointed one. The one that in all of history has now come to bring you peace with God. The one that is anointed and separated and selected to be the one that brings light and hope and peace. Why do you think it took so long for the disciples to make their discovery? Well, they needed all the component parts, I suspect. It will be the cross and resurrection, and we who live the other side of Calvary and an empty tomb. We already had that experience. For them, they're coming at this for the first time. It is a struggle. It's a struggle to make that declaration. It's a struggle to make that confession, but it is so important. How can we help people when they come to the fork in the road moments in their own lives? Because they do. I meet them every day, people who have decisions to take, decisions to make, the kind of people who are struggling and wanting to know the way forward, and also trying to understand the suffering that happens in their own lives. And all I can say is that we can observe Jesus, and we can see much from what he went through in helping to be an inspiration in our own lives. But you know, don't you think it's interesting? He gets it right and then he gets it wrong so quickly. He says, you are the Christ, and that is the right answer. And then the next thing is wrong answer. And you know, that's often like that. Do you remember they went up on the hillside with him when he was transfigured? They come down the hillside and there's people, and the disciples are arguing about who should be the place of position. They couldn't, on another gospel account, bring healing in a very simple situation. We often get it wrong after we get it right. Caesarea Philippi was a great turning moment. It involves being realistic about challenge. The moment involved a degree of self-awareness on Peter's part, not only towards the ministry of Jesus, but towards his own response. And then let's thirdly come to that place where we talk about the great significance of the moment and just remind ourselves of the great significance of this moment for Peter, for the disciples, for you and for me. Peter's declaration served to open up the pathway and the road that lay ahead. He calls the disciples to Jesus to follow him in earnest. You know, the term Messiah is only found 7 times in Mark's gospel and only 3 times on the lips of Jesus. So this isn't something that every minute of the day is being talked about. But perhaps his reluctance to use the title was because it was open to such misunderstanding on the people's part. Mark has this theme, doesn't he? It's the messianic secret, the revelatory element, where there must be death and resurrection to be able to make sense of this journey. The messianic secret in Mark is one of the greatest of themes. And here it is again. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. I wrestle with that. I say, well, surely, Jesus, you want them to know who you are. They get it right and they say who you are. And Jesus said, don't tell anyone. Well, I think there's something deep in that there will be a time, and there will be a time when they can talk about it. But they're not ready. There is so much more. Perhaps I don't know of all the emotions that are around here. Perhaps Jesus is pleased at their willingness to declare who he is. But perhaps aware, all too aware, that there is so much yet to learn. Mark has no problem about identifying who Jesus is. In fact, as I turn the pages of my gospel over, it opens up in the very first chapter, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So in the life of the early Christian community, it was quite normal to talk about Messiah, but at this point, it was a critical moment of great significance. The way he came, the fulfillment of Old Testament scripture, the constant talking about Messiah, the words he spoke, the actions he did, the works he demonstrated, the way he died, and the confirmation of all this that has made sense in resurrection. There still remains an important question for all of us. Who do you say I am? I reckon if you were studying the scriptures, that God would ask that question of you and I regularly. Who do you say I am? In the light of what you now see, in the setting you find, who do you say I am? And our answer to that question, who do you say I am, sets us up for the next part of the journey. I have a great love for the West Country of England, and I'll tell you why. I began my ministry there. And I was deeply touched when I received an invitation in 2017 to go back and preach at my first church. I wondered if there's anybody still there that would remember who I was, really. It's 37 years ago. And to go back to the Central Mission at the heart of Plymouth. Plymouth is famous for another reason. Not only is it the place where the Pilgrim Fathers set out on the Mayflower, and the ship went down to the southern coast of England before it headed off to America. But it's also famous because of another great seaman called Sir Francis Drake. Drake was a great explorer, journeyman, sailor. And he had to fill, as most of the sailors did, their boats with fresh talent. And so it was that he knew what it was to go out in Devon and speak to the crowds. And he had difficulties recruiting staff. He would gather young men, because they were all men, on hillsides, overlooking the sea. And he would tell them that they're going to have beautiful sights, gorgeous breezes. This is going to be the trip of a lifetime. And he couldn't get the ship filled. So he changed his strategy, the steps that you take to get to your vision. He changed his strategy. He said, I need recruits, but it's going to be very hard. He said there are going to be gales that blow us off course. There are going to be many days when we don't know where we are. There's not going to be enough water on the ship. Do you know what happened? The recruits came. Why did they do that? Well, because Drake knew not only was the truth important, but he knew there was something in the spirit of women and men that calls them to a challenge. And I'm just so grateful that at the heart of this gospel is a deep, deep challenge. It's why when we come to evangelism, I could climb walls when I listen to people promising folks that tonight this is going to be the beginning of the rest of your life and it's going to be wonderful from this moment on. I feel like saying, preacher, stop! From this moment tonight is the beginning of the challenge. From this moment, people go back to work where they've got to be honest at work. From this moment, when they know what it is to start smacking the kids, they've got to say to themselves, hey, hang on a minute. From this moment, when they are divided about from this moment is the rest of the tough life of what it means to follow. Let alone the fact you've got to come into the church. with all its brokenness and all its challenges there. Drake knew that, and so they came. Our challenge in a multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multicultural society, in a context in which the community of family life is more unstable now than at any time than we've ever known. In a context where authority and respect for community and leaders is at an all-time low. An Australia that is becoming, in one sense, more prosperous, and yet at the same time with a widening gulf between the rich and the poor. And a context where explanations about spirituality are as broad as it comes. Observing Jesus is important. Watch him, listen to him, and see what he has to say to you. We just experienced the excitement of the Olympiad. One of my high moments is when they let us run that relay leg again. Didn't you think that was something else? Because they'd done us in, didn't they? They said, yeah, you can have a run at this. And so the Aussies ran against nobody, just against themselves. But you know, apart from cross-country running, most of the sports that I've been involved in have been team games, team sports. And I've learned the hard way, there is one strategy that is damaging to the result of any game, and that is never sit on a lead. Never get yourself in front and think it's over. Because once you do that, you invariably lose. A growing church, a Christian community in this tough world in which we've now got to live, complacency is our greatest peril. And when Peter is there declaring, you are the Christ, within 5 minutes, he's down in another context getting it all so wrong. We can't sit back. We, like Peter, must declare, you are the Christ, and realize we've got to face the world with all its power, with all at times its evil, and with all its challenge. You've got no choice. So Dad got it right, didn't he? He said there was a fork in the road. But it wasn't comedy. It was true. There's a fork in your road too. Which way are you choosing? The easy way or the difficult way? There's only one that will bring the saving news of Jesus Christ to this world.